Okay, good evening. Welcome to, I think, the fifth in our series here at Shari Tefillah. Tonight's program is called Is Religion Killing Judaism? Jews for Judaism has sometimes been referred to as the 911 of the Jewish community. We basically see the casualties, the people that drop out, the people that convert to other religions, the people who are alienated, the people who basically have distanced themselves from the Jewish community. And we hear their complaints and their hurts and their disappointments. And the Jewish community became very, very focused on this issue about 15 years ago. There was a word that was becoming very popular about that time. The word was continuity. There was a sudden realization that the continuity of the Jewish people was in danger. That somehow the very existence of the Jewish people was being called into question because of all of these tremendous problems. There was an advertisement that appeared in a New York Anglo-Jewish newspaper about 20 years ago. It's a pretty ominous looking advertisement. It had cobwebs and spiders' webs and bats, a very sort of spooky, creepy kind of a setting. And the banner headline read, "If you are Jewish, the chances are that your grandchildren won't be." And that reflected the angst in the Jewish world about whether or not somehow we're going to survive into the next generation or the next century. In 1990, there was actually a study that was done of the American Jewish population that showed 12% of American Jews in 1990 were practicing a religion other than Judaism. By the year 2000, the same study revealed that 25% of American Jews, it's 1.6 million, were practicing a religion other than Judaism. I'm not quite sure the numbers translate into Canadian reality, the Canadian reality, but let me share a few sobering thoughts with you. Right here in this part of Canada, the leading Sikh teacher is a fellow named Harinam Singh Khalsa, who grew up David Friedman about 63 or 64 years ago downtown in the Kensington Market section of Toronto. We estimate today that about 30% of all Westerners practicing Buddhism come from a Jewish background. We know that the Jews for Jesus movement has grown in North America from approximately 15 or so congregations in the early 1970s to about 500 congregations now. So we see dramatic growth in all of these areas. I went to a meeting just a few years ago here in Toronto of the Sufis. That's a mystical Islamic sect where the whirling dervishes were performing. And one of the leaders of the Sufi movement here in Toronto is a Jewish Holocaust survivor, an elderly gentleman. And so we realize that today, Jewish people in increasing numbers are not in the Jewish world, they're somewhere else. The intermarriage rate grew when I was a child in the early 50s, even into the 1960s. The American intermarriage rate was about 6%. Going back to the 1960s, today it's over 50%. And so we have all of these forces that are impinging upon Jewish continuity in North America. And finally, probably the most serious problem is something that Shlomo Carlebach used to refer to, not as the Jews for Jesus, but as the Jews for nothing. Increasing number of Jewish people who simply have no interest, association, with their Jewishness whatsoever. It's almost similar to what happens when many Israeli students come to university here in North America. I've heard from many of them who say, "I'm not Jewish, I'm Israeli." So there's a tremendous disconnect between Jewish people and their own Jewishness. What I found over the years, after meeting countless people that fall into this category, is that in reality, none of them have ever rejected Judaism. That's on some level a truth that I think applies to almost all of these people I've been describing. almost none of them have ever rejected Judaism. What I think that they have rejected is a very sad caricature of Judaism, a very distorted picture of what they assume Judaism might be. You know, they tell a story of one of the great early Hasidic Rebbes, a student of the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Mezrich. Someone approached him once and said, "Rabbi, I just want you to know that I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God." And the Maggid of Mezrich said to him, "Do you know, I'm willing to bet that the very same God that you don't believe in, I don't believe in that God either." Who is the God that the atheist rejects? And it may have very, very little to do with the God of Judaism. If a person's image of God is some cranky old man in the sky that is always saying no to us, someone that's always angry and always punishing us, if that's a person's vision of God, the Maggid of Mezrich was saying, "I don't blame you for not believing in that God." They tell a story about someone from Chelm, one of the wise men from Chelm. He's walking down the street one day and he sees who he thinks is an old friend of his. And he comes up to him and he says, "Yankel, is that you? You know, it's been so long, Yankel, but something doesn't seem right, because I remember, Yankel, when I used to know you, you looked good, you were dressed nicely, you were put together, your hair was combed nicely, you look like a good-looking guy, and now look at you, look terrible. You're dressed like a slob, your hair is all out of place, you don't look good, what happened to you?" So the fellow says, "Excuse me, my name isn't Yankel." And he says, "And look, you even changed your name." So when we see things in this world, do we really know what we're confronting, right? When we reject Judaism, is it Judaism? When we meet Yankel, is it Yankel? Could be someone altogether different. One of the problems is that the Judaism that many people hear today is a very off-key kind of Judaism. They hear a music that's very off-key. When I was a freshman in university, I had a roommate that we were like the odd couple. And that year, I think it was 1970 if I'm not mistaken, or 1971, Cat Stevens had his debut album. It was called Teaser and the Fire Cat. And it was very popular. I was crazy about one of the songs, and I used to walk around singing it all the time. I thought the song was called the B String. And I would, in the dormitory room, sing B String, make me happy, fly on the B String. And one day Doug says to me, "Skobac, it's Peace Train, you idiot." I'm hearing B String, and the song is about Peace Train. And the reality is that we often don't hear the right words. A friend of mine once told me that he had thought that the Beatles song, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds," was singing about the girl with colitis goes by. Actually, the line is about the girl with kaleidoscope eyes. But people hear the wrong words. There's actually an entire website that was built to explore this phenomenon. It takes off on a line from the Jimi Hendrix song where the refrain of the actual song is "Excuse me while I kiss the sky." And this is a website that's called www.kissthisguy.com. And it lists thousands and thousands of songs, thousands, where people misheard the lyrics. And so one of the great problems I believe that we're encountering is that people simply hear a very off-key Judaism. They're hearing really the wrong words. But it goes beyond that. The Baal Shem Tov told a wonderful parable of a man walking in the forest, and he comes across a very, very long building, a long rectangular building. You can imagine almost like the width of this room. And the building has one window all the way at one side of the building. So he walks up to this window. Now, because the window is all the way at one side, the extreme, his peripheral vision is cut off. He can't see all the way down the other end of the room. He can only see about halfway into the room. And he walks over, he looks into this window, and what does he see? He sees dozens and dozens and dozens of people running around in circles, jumping up and down, doing somersaults. Something else was happening. Not only was his vision cut, he couldn't see all the way to the other end of the room, but the Baal Shem Tov said he had a second problem. This person was very, very hard of hearing. He was so hard of hearing he was practically deaf. And so he wasn't able to see down at that end of the building a band playing, and because of his hearing problem, he couldn't hear them. And so he looks into this room, and he sees all these people running around in circles, jumping up and down, doing somersaults. He thinks it's an insane asylum. He thinks they got a bunch of Mishugayim here, a bunch of crazy people. He can't imagine what in the world is going on. And the Baal Shem Tov said, you know what the problem is? He can't hear the music. There's a wedding happening. There's a beautiful experience here, a beautiful wedding. People are dancing. They're trying to make the bride and groom happy. They're trying to perform. And this person thinks it's a bunch of crazy people because he can't hear the music. And so many Jewish people, their experience, their encounter with Judaism is they look at a movement of people doing things that to them look totally crazy because they don't hear the music. I think that at the heart of this issue is one of impression. The way people have impressions, the way they size things up. And the premise of tonight's talk is that people associate Judaism with a religion. Judaism is a religion. And my premise is that people do not have very warm, fuzzy, positive associations with what religion is. And so if they associate Judaism as a religion, Judaism gets tarred by the equation. Now, I read a very fascinating study recently about a woman who's apparently the greatest copywriter. She makes the copy for these obnoxious infomercials that you see on television at 3:30 in the morning. And apparently she came up with a brilliant way of improving these commercials that dramatically improved how sales were going. So imagine usually you see this half-hour commercial about some sharp knife or a vacuum cleaner, whatever they're selling, and usually at the end of the commercial they would say, please call this number, operators are standing by waiting for your call. That's how they normally end these infomercials. This woman had a brainstorm. She said, we're going to change the last line. We're going to change it. And she wrote the following. She said, please call this number. If it's busy, please call back. That's all, simple change. The sales increased dramatically. Why? Why did the sales increase so dramatically? Because of this small change. So she realized that it would work because of the impression people have in their minds. When they hear this line that says, please call, operators are standing by waiting for your call, people probably imagine a big room with people sitting around, bored out of their mind, falling asleep. They're waiting, finally someone called. However, the way she rewrote the ad, if you call and lines are busy, please call back. Now you probably imagine people sitting around desks, the phones are ringing off the hook, they're answering the phone, can't answer them fast enough. People are assuming, wow, this product, they must be selling like hotcakes. It must be really good, everyone's buying it. So by simply changing the impression that people walked away with after watching a half-hour commercial, the product was the same, nothing changed, but people's impression, people's association with that product changed, and the results were dramatic. The rabbis tell a very cute story, one of the midrashim, that in the beginning of the creation of the world, all of the trees came to God. They were very, very upset. The trees were very nervous. What happened? They came to God and they had a complaint. They said, God, we heard that you now have iron in the world. Iron? What are you, crazy? People are going to make axes. They're going to chop us down. That's not good. That's terrible. So God says to the trees, you know, you're very foolish. If you wouldn't allow your wood to be used for the handle of the axe, the iron could never hurt you. The iron can only hurt you if you allow your wood to become part of the axe, to be the handle. What are the rabbis teaching us here? They're teaching us that usually we are our own worst enemies. We are causing the damage to ourselves. So when we allow this association that people assume that Judaism is a religion, that's not helpful. You know, it's interesting that the word religion never appears in the Jewish Bible. There is no word for religion in the Jewish Bible. There's a modern Hebrew word, dat, but it doesn't appear in our Tanakh. There must be a reason for that. My Rabbi in yeshiva would always say to us, Judaism is a loyal religion. It's not a religion. People often assume that religions get in the way. They cramp our style. They're stultifying. They're annoying. Religions are just a bunch of do's and don'ts, and often more don'ts. Don't do this, don't do that. And so it's very common for people to assume that religions are just annoyances. They get in the way, they make our lives miserable. The rabbis told a wonderful story that going back again to the beginning of the creation of the world, every single animal came to God to thank God for giving that animal the tools to survive. So one animal comes to God and says, God, this is so cool. If anyone tries to attack me, I'm able to emit this foul odor, and anyone that comes to get me, they run away. They can't stand being near me. Thank you, God. This stink is amazing. And another animal comes to God and says, God, thank you so much, because I'm able to camouflage myself if anyone comes to attack me and they can't find me. That's amazing. And another animal says to God, God, shkoyach, thank you very much. You know, if anyone comes to get me, I can shoot out these little spikes and they go running away. And another animal comes and says, God, it's amazing that you gave me the ability to run so fast, no one can catch me, I'm okay. And the big elephant comes to God and says, God, thank you so much, because I'm so huge, no one's going to even want to start up with me. And every single animal comes to God to thank God for giving that animal the tools to survive. One animal finally comes and says, where's the complaint department? I'm very upset. This little bird comes to God and says, look, God, you gave me these little skinny, tiny little legs, I can hardly stand up. And on my back, you gave me these clumps, they weighed me down. I'm a sitting duck. So God says to this animal, you don't understand. Those clumps on your back are wings, and with those wings you can fly. So you think about something very simple. People look at a Jewish Shabbat. They have this nightmare, oy, Shabbat, a day of torture. I can't do this, and I can't do that, and I can't do this, and I can't do that. Not realizing that people who observe Shabbat will tell you they would not give it up for anything in the world. They understand that Shabbat is a day of complete freedom. It's a day when we're not subjugated and we're not under the control of all of these conveniences that we've created to somehow make our life more convenient, and yet we become captured by them, and now we can't live without them. And so it's impossible to sit in a room and the phone ring and I don't have to jump and get the phone. So people begin to understand that Shabbat are not clumps that weight us down. They're wings that allow us to fly. It's a day where we're able to be truly human. We can be ourselves. We don't have to run away. We don't have to try and busy ourselves with all the distractions that take us over during the week. It's a day where we come in touch with our essence. And yet when we have this word religion, we have this word that has very negative associations. You know, when you're in a debate with someone, it's always very, very handicapping to allow the opposition in the debate to frame the terms of the debate. Without getting political tonight, when you refer to citizens of Israel as settlers rather than citizens, that changes the equation. When you refer to land as occupied land rather than disputed territory, that changes the equation. When people are activists rather than terrorists, that changes the equation. Language is very, very powerful. And so the impression created by language is extremely important. And so this word religion has associations like, oh, religion, what a terrible thing to impose upon ourselves. It cramps my style. People associate religion as something that's really okay if you need it. It's okay for people that need it as a crutch. Like the Marxists would say, it's the opiate of the masses. I remember when I was first exploring Judaism, my Jewish friends would patronize me and say, well, religion is okay, Michael, if you need it. As if the only people who really have any connection to religion are people that are pathetic losers and emotional cripples. Now, how did we get this association with religion? Why do we associate religion as something that's a crutch, something that you need to solve your problems? One of the reasons is because in North America, and actually in the world, the dominant religion in the world is sold exactly like that. If you ever watch Christian television, that's how Jesus is sold. Do you have a drug problem, a money problem, a marriage problem, an emotional problem, problem with your kids, any problem, come to Dr. Jesus and your problems will go away. So people are being exposed to this idea that religion is just to take care of your problems. I remember years ago, David Steinberg, who I think has Canadian roots, famous comedian, and also I think the son of rabbis going back generations. He was once in a studio that was filming television shows, and in the next studio was Oral Roberts, the famous faith healer. He would smack people in the head, they'd get cured. So David Steinberg was cute, you know, a Yiddish kid. He walks up in the next studio, he goes over to he goes over to Oral Roberts, he shakes his hand, and he walked away with a limp. That's what a Jewish kid does. So, but people have this association that that's religion. Religion is basically to help you with your problems. A wise person, however, once said that real religion is not to comfort the afflicted. Real religion is here to afflict the comfortable. It's not here to make our lives totally problem-free. It creates its own unique problems that are actually the most wonderful problems in the world to deal with. People associate religions with, one of the expressions we have is organized religion. Institutions, bureaucracy. When I was in India in 1998, I traveled to northern India to run Passover Seders for Israeli travelers. So I had a woman sitting next to me on the floor. We didn't have chairs back then. And a woman, we had an 8-hour Seder. She's sitting next to me. She's from the West Coast of the United States, from California. And we got into a conversation. I asked her, how did she end up, she actually moved to India. She was living there. She was a single mom with 2 kids. She says to me that when she was living in California, she tried going to synagogues. And her experience was she'd go into a synagogue and it was this meeting and sisterhood and brotherhood and this committee, that committee. She said all she encountered was a bureaucracy, institution, meetings, committees. She said to me with tears in her eye, I was only looking for a place to go and be reverent. She wanted to be able to sit and feel that she was in the presence of God. When I was a teenager, I was a very, very near casualty to a toxic association I had with the idea of religion. I was very much a child of the 60s. My religion was, I probably sounded like a Miss America contestant, my religion was world peace. That's the only thing I was interested in. That was my passion. And I saw religions as evil. Because as a teenager that was very idealistic, I saw religions as institutions that divided people, that caused strife, that caused dissension, that caused war. And because religions divided people, I saw them as a tremendous impediment to world peace and to tranquility. And so for me, all religions were evil, and because my religion that was being imposed upon me was Judaism, I took out most of my hostility on Judaism. In high school, some of my friends referred to me as the class anti-Semite. And one of the discussions that came up frequently when I was a teenager was over this question of intermarriage and interdating. And I was often told, you know, you're not supposed to marry a non-Jew, you're Jewish. And I would say, why not? And they said, because we don't marry non-Jews. And why not? Because you're Jewish. But why don't we marry non-Jews? Because we don't. Why not? Because you're Jewish. And you could hear how incredibly persuasive this must have been to a 15-year-old. I remember meeting with a rabbi before I went away to university to discuss this very topic. And I asked him to explain, what is this hang-up Jews have with intermarriage? And he said, well, you see, if every Jew would marry out of the faith, then the Jewish people would disappear. Now, he assumed this was a slam dunk. And I said to him, so what? So what if all the Jews disappeared? Would it somehow destroy the ecosystem? The world wouldn't be able to exist if there were no more people eating bagels and lox? It didn't really make sense to me why there was this obsession with survival. Was history some weird contest where the oldest lasting religion at the end of history wins? Why was it so important, so critical to have Jews in the world? And unfortunately, the rabbi was not able to really answer this question to my satisfaction. He probably gave a decent answer, but I was a little bit difficult to deal with. And I remember walking out saying to the rabbi, you know, you're just a racist. Because if you're just telling people you can't marry people of other faiths just because you have to keep the people in the faith, that's racism at best. So I go away to university, and I'm roomed with this fellow from the Midwest United States. He had probably never met a Jew in his life. And he was very happy that he was living with a Jewish kid from New Jersey. He thought I was practically a rabbi. And he was very happy because he had met a Jewish girl from Long Island the first week of school, a girl named Lisa. And he was very nervous. He's not a Jew. He doesn't know about Jews. And how is he going to talk to this girl? He doesn't have anything in common with her. And he thought that it'd be like Cyrano de Bergerac. I'd be able to tutor him and help him and explain to him, you know, what Jews are all about. And he discovered after a few days that he's living with an anti-Semitic Jew. His luck, his mazel, that he's paired with a Jewish kid from New Jersey who hates Judaism. So it was a very strange relationship. He's trying to learn about being Jewish, and he's reading Martin Buber books. And he's got someone that he saw as really evil living with him. Most of that year, again, I mentioned that I was very, very passionate about trying to somehow bring peace to the world. That was when the Americans were fighting, at that time, 2 wars, one in Vietnam, one in Cambodia, actually one big war in the Far East. And a lot of what I was doing was trying to somehow, as a naive young college student, stop these wars. So I would go to many protests and demonstrations. The last semester of my freshman year in university, we organized a moratorium to close down the university. We had a boycott of all the classes, and we organized among some of us a hunger strike, that for 3 weeks I didn't eat anything. I just had about 3,000 cc's of fruit juice a day. And we had a big tent we put up on the side of the main road in the campus trying to block traffic, and we had a big sign that said "Juice for Peace." We were all drinking juice, but we were joking among ourselves because all of us were practically Jewish. We were saying it should be called Jews for Peace. And what was interesting was that a number of my comrades were Jewish university students who themselves were beginning to explore their Jewish roots. If you remember back then, there was a famous book that came out by Alex Haley, I think his name was, called Roots. And North American people from Africa were trying to explore their African roots. And they were wearing dashikis, and they were trying to, you know, come to understand what does it mean to be really from Africa. And some Jews were getting involved with the same self-exploration. And a number of these Jewish students, who were my cohorts in this counter-war, anti-war movement, were very disturbed by what they saw as a huge chip on my shoulder. And they said to me, a number of them, they said, you know, for someone who has such disdain for Judaism, they said, it's strange to us that you seem to know absolutely nothing about Judaism. And their challenge was, wouldn't it make sense before you reject it forever to first find out what it is? And I was open-minded enough to admit that they had a point. And so at the end of my first year of university, I left and I went to a school in New York for wayward Jews. They actually had a school that was set up for Jewish young men that had no Jewish background. And I attended this school. And what I discovered there was quite ironic, because it turned out that the very point, the very idea that I found to be the most problematic, the most offensive about Judaism as a religion, turned out to be the very point that actually drew me into Judaism. I learned here for the first time, and I think it's a tragedy that it took me until then in my life to hear this idea, but I learned there for the first time in my life that Judaism has a vision of being a 3,000-year-old movement that has been dedicated to actually fixing and repairing the world. In Hebrew we call it tikkun olam. That one of the great visions of Judaism is that the world started off as a paradise in the Garden of Eden, and then it broke. The world broke, and things went downhill from there. And Judaism became a movement to return to Eden, to get back to the garden, to fix things, to make it a world of peace. And so I was exposed to this beautiful and inspiring idea that Judaism is a movement that on some level is very focused on this idea of repairing the world, of fixing the world. And I came to realize that my most deeply cherished values were the exact same values as Judaism. But I had to come to a second realization, that I realized that as a hippie, my idealism was very sloppy. When was I able to actualize my idealism? When was I able to express my idealism? It was very sporadic. If someone happened to organize a protest or a demonstration, if I happened to get into a debate with someone, but really, was I able to somehow manifest and express my idealism 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? And what I was impressed with, what really captured my imagination in terms of Judaism, was that it's an integrated system, a totally holistic integrated system that allows us to express and really be involved with our idealism 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I wanted to live that kind of a life, where it wasn't just part of me, my idealism, but it was everything. Where every single moment of the day I can be involved somehow in this project of fixing the world. Now I have to confess to you that in the many, many years that I've been teaching Judaism, I have not met many people who came to Judaism like I did for political reasons. That was essentially my path to Judaism. I saw it as an incredible political institution that will ultimately fix the world. That was the path in for me. But I'll tell you that for the vast majority of people that I encounter today, their objection to Judaism is not a political one. They express it in the following way. They say, you know what, I'm not interested in religion, I am interested in spirituality. That is the mantra that we hear today. I'm not interested in religion, I'm interested in spirituality. And what is the assumption? The assumption is, obviously, that religions are not spiritual, that somehow they're mutually exclusive. And so we have a serious problem here. We have so many people today who are not connecting with Judaism because they're looking for a spiritual life. I heard a wonderful interview last year over the internet. It was with a woman who today is one of the most popular Jewish writers on the internet and actually has two wonderful books, one a bestseller. She grew up not far from me in suburban New Jersey. She grew up in Cherry Hill. And after high school, I think maybe even after university, she ended up becoming a Hindu for about 17 years, much of that time spent on a Hindu ashram. And then her life took her by a very long journey to Jerusalem, where she re-encountered her Jewishness. And again, today she is one of the I believe, one of the most wonderful Jewish writers on the planet. And in the interview, she was asked, what was missing for you as you were growing up Jewishly? What was missing from your Jewish experience when you were growing up as a teenager? And she said, wistfully, two words. There were two things that were missing for her. Number one, she said God, and number two, she said growth. God and growth. What does she mean by this? I'll illustrate the first part with a story my wife told me. My wife grew up in Ohio. Her parents were both Hebrew school teachers. After university, she ended up going to the Far East to live in India and Bali for half a year. And she was very, very drawn to the Eastern religions that she was exposed to. What particularly impressed her was the fact that spirituality there was not a once a year or 3 times a year or once a week experience. Spirituality seemed to permeate the moment-to-moment lives of the people that she met. People were able to have spiritual lives, not spiritual moments. And she was drawn to that. So she came back to New York, and her spiritual path essentially became Hinduism. She was meditating, doing yoga, going to ashrams. And one day, she turned on a radio in New York to a station, WBAI, listener-sponsored radio, to a program she had not heard in a very long time. It was a Sunday morning program where different religious leaders would appear on Sunday morning to speak about their religion. This Sunday happened to be Rabbi Gedalia Koenig, who was the leader of the Breslov community in Tzfat, in Israel. And he was speaking in Hebrew. There was a woman translating, a man translating into English. My wife was listening with tremendous attention. And she said to me at one point, her mouth flew open, and she said to herself, "Wow, I never knew that Jews believed in God." Now, how could she have said that? She went to a synagogue as a kid. Her parents both taught Hebrew school. She had a bat mitzvah. She did all the Jewish things that we all do. She went lit Hanukkah candles, and she had a Passover Seder. She did all this stuff, and she never knew that Jews believed in God. And she said the reason is because God, it's true, was a word that people would say the word obviously, but she never experienced in the Jewishness that she was exposed to, people who actually tried to develop a personal relationship with God. She never met Jewish people who were ever speaking about feeling the presence of God in their lives. She didn't really meet Jewish people who felt close to God and who felt intimate with God and who felt that God was real and that God heard them and they could speak to God. God was a word that she would hear once in a while. Someone made a blessing, they would say the name of God. But for her, God was not real. And for Sarah Yocheved Rigler, who gave this interview, she said God was missing because it wasn't part of the Jewish world that she was living in. People did not seem to have a focus on getting close to God and feeling God in their life. And so many of these Jewish people today are in churches where they think in a church that's where you can actually have a relationship with God. Or they become Hindu. The second word that Sarah Rigler said was missing from her Jewish life growing up was growth. What does she mean by that? Let's look at a little kid as the kid is growing up. Imagine a little kid is born, and you watch this child between the ages of 0 and 10. Can you picture a child growing up between 0 and 10? Do you notice any changes in that 10-year period? Is there any difference between the child at 0 and the child at 10? I mean, it's incredible. It's an infinite change. At 0, you're a zygote, and at 10, you're a little kid talking back to your parents. I mean, it's huge what happens in those 10 years. The change is dramatic. Think about someone between the ages of 10 and 20. 10-year-old kid, a 20-year-old young person, young adult. Are there changes that take place in those 10 years? Do you notice any differences? I mean, it's incredible. 10 years old, you're a little brat. At 20, you could be married already, or soon to be married. Watch people between 20 and 30, and between 30 and 40, and between 40 and 50, and 50 and 60, and 60 and 70, and 70 and 80, and ask yourself, are there serious changes taking place? Are the people between 30 and 40, 40 and 50 really changing that dramatically in those 10 years? Or are they just as cranky when they were 50 as when they were 40? Or the only changes that you really see in those period of time is they get a little bit heavier maybe, a little bit grayer, a little bit less hair, a little bit more hunched over. But what's really taking place in terms of who they are as people? And what Sarah Rigler was saying was that her exposure to Judaism growing up didn't provide any evidence that Judaism had anything to do with personal growth. She saw people lighting candles, she saw people eating matzah, she saw people going to a synagogue and saying prayers. She didn't see how any of this had one drop, anything to do with becoming someone who was more patient, with becoming someone who expressed more gratitude as they went through life, with becoming someone who was less arrogant, with becoming more sensitive, with developing more inner peace, with getting control of your anger. She didn't see how anything she was exposed to as Judaism had anything to do with developing as a person. And so many Jewish people today who don't realize that Judaism is a system of dynamic personal growth and change, of transformation, because they were never exposed to the teachings of Judaism that deal with this. So they think they have to go to India to learn how to meditate. They don't realize that Judaism has an ancient 3,000-year-old meditative tradition. They think they have to become Buddhists to learn how to deal with anger, not realizing that Judaism has incredibly powerful teachings on every one of these topics. And so we're living in a world today where so many Jewish people are not connecting with Judaism because they're simply unaware of what Judaism actually teaches. I remember when I was working at York University, a woman came to see me, a young student who was an environmental studies major. She was very, very upset. She came from a very assimilated Jewish background, really didn't know anything about Judaism, but she knew that she was a Jew. And she came to me, she was very upset because the teacher told them in their first day of class that Judaism and the Jewish Bible is responsible for the destruction of our planet. Judaism and the Jewish Bible is responsible for the destruction, the rape of our planet and our ecosystem. Why? Because in the first chapter of Genesis, God says to humanity that you're supposed to conquer the world, v'chivshuha. Take it over, exploit it, conquer it. And she said, is that true? Is that what Judaism teaches? And I said to her, you know, it would probably be helpful if we want to understand what the Bible's teachings are about ecology and environmentalism, to read not just one sentence, but to study everything the Bible teaches. And so we spent time studying together all the teachings of the Bible, the teachings of the Talmud, about environmental ethics, about how we are to treat the planet, and how we are to live on this planet, and how the Bible teaches us not to waste anything, not to destroy anything. And the Bible speaks about building green belts around urban centers. How the Bible had teachings about ecology and the environment 3,000 years ago that modern man didn't know 100 years ago. And she became a very, very proud Jew as a result of learning what Judaism actually taught about the environment. And so we live in a world today where we just are losing so many Jewish people to this kind of ignorance. The prophet Hosea would say thousands of years ago, my people are perishing due to a lack of knowledge. And so people who don't realize that Judaism is a path that is supposed to lead us to God, they'll go elsewhere. People who don't realize that Judaism is an integrated, holistic system of personal growth and transformation will go elsewhere. People who don't realize that Judaism has wisdom about every topic in the world will go elsewhere. They tell a story about an old fellow that had a store in a strip mall. He was selling for years and years and years discounted items and tchotchkes and souvenirs. He made a living. He scratched by a living. He was selling these things for many years. One day he gets very upset. He looks on one side of his store is a brand new huge discount store that's opening up and has a big sign in the front of it that says, you can't beat our prices. And on the other side he sees even a bigger store, a huge store that's selling stuff very cheap, and it says lowest prices in town. And this poor little yidel is so upset, they're going to kill me, they're going to drive me out of business. What do I do? So his friend said to him, you know what, I have some advice for you. You just put up a big sign in front of your store that says main entrance. That's all you have to do. And so the challenge to us today is, how do we create a Jewish world of deep and profound spirituality, joy, love, passion, that will become the main entrance to our Jewish brothers and sisters today who are not connecting with what it means to be Jewish.